Have you ever wondered if the people closest to you, your best friend, your colleague, or even your partner, are truly who they seem to be? What if I told you that beneath the smiles, the successes, and the polished social media feeds, there's a hidden layer that reveals the real them, and it's shockingly easy to spot once you know where to look? Right now, you're living in the most deceptive era in human history. Social media has turned everyone into master image crafters. Dating apps reward perfect facades. Professional networking is built on polished personas. Even your closest relationships might be built on carefully curated versions of who people really are. The result? You're surrounded by psychological mirages, people who seem confident but crumble under pressure, partners who appear loving but turn cold when challenged, colleagues who project competence but blame everyone else when things go wrong. You chose to watch this because something inside you knows there's more beneath the surface. You felt that nagging suspicion that the people around you aren't quite who they seem. And maybe, if you're honest, neither are you. That instinct is absolutely correct, and today I'm going to validate it completely. My mission isn't just to help you read people better. It's to fundamentally transform how you see human nature itself. Because what Carl Jung discovered about the human psyche will shatter every assumption you have about personality, relationships, and even your own identity. Jung found that every person operates like a psychological iceberg. What you see, the confidence, the kindness, the success, that's just 10% floating above the waterline. But beneath the surface lies something far more revealing, the shadow. And Jung developed two questions so powerful they can expose both layers within minutes of meeting someone. Here's what makes this urgent. The people who master psychological deception are already using these insights against you. The difference is, they're using them to manipulate, while I'm going to teach you to use them for truth. By the end of this, you'll possess Jung's two psychological keys. Questions that reveal not just who people really are beneath their masks, but who you really are beneath yours. Because once you learn to see what's hidden beneath the surface, you can never unsee it. Here's what Jung realized that changed psychology forever. We're all living double lives, and most of us don't even know it. Meet Rebecca, a 34-year-old corporate lawyer who commands every room she enters. Sharp suits, sharper wit, the kind of person who never seems rattled by anything. Her colleagues see success incarnate, but Rebecca has a secret she's buried so deep, she's almost convinced herself it doesn't exist. She's terrified of being seen as incompetent. Every confident gesture, every decisive statement, every perfectly timed joke is armor protecting a core belief that whispers, "You don't belong here." This is what Jung called the persona, the mask we craft to meet the world's expectations and hide our vulnerabilities. But here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. The persona isn't just what we show others. It becomes what we believe we are. Rebecca doesn't think she's hiding insecurity. She genuinely believes she's naturally confident. The mask has become her identity. But Jung discovered something that would revolutionize how we understand human behavior. For every trait we display in our persona, there's an equal and opposite force buried in what he called the shadow. Rebecca's polished confidence exists precisely because she's rejected and buried her natural uncertainty. Her shadow contains not just her fears, but also her suppressed authenticity, the parts of herself she decided weren't acceptable. Here's the psychological mechanism that changes everything. We don't just hide our shadow from others, we project it onto them. When Rebecca encounters someone who openly admits uncertainty or asks for help, she experiences a visceral reaction, disgust, irritation, judgment. Why? Because they're displaying the very qualities she's spent years convincing herself she doesn't possess. Jung called this projection, and it's happening around you constantly. The person who can't stand attention seekers has likely suppressed their own need for recognition. The The colleague who despises lazy people is probably denying their own desire to rest. The friend who judges others as too emotional has likely buried their own capacity for vulnerability. This is why Jung's approach to reading people is so devastatingly effective. He didn't focus on what people show you. Anyone can fake confidence, kindness, or success for a conversation. He focused on what triggers them, what they can't tolerate in others, because that's where their disowned shadow material lives. Think about someone who really gets under your skin. Maybe it's a co-worker who's always playing the victim, or a friend who name drops constantly, or that person who interrupts every conversation. Jung would ask, what if your reaction isn't really about them? What if it's your shadow screaming for attention? But here's where Jung's insight becomes truly powerful. The shadow doesn't just contain our flaws, it holds our unrealized potential. That person whose ambition disgusts you. Maybe you've suppressed your own drive to achieve. The friend whose emotional openness makes you uncomfortable. Perhaps you've buried your own capacity for authentic expression. Sarah, a successful marketing executive, couldn't understand why she felt such contempt for her assistant Mike, who seemed to waste time chatting with everyone in the office. To Sarah, he was unprofessional, unfocused. But Jung would point out that Mike was displaying something Sarah had sacrificed for success: genuine human connection. Her shadow contained the warm, socially connected person she'd buried under layers of professional achievement. This is the psychological foundation that makes Jung's two questions so powerful. They don't ask what you think about yourself. That's just persona talking. They target your shadow through the back door, revealing the hidden architecture of your personality through what you reject in others. The genius is in the indirectness. Ask someone to describe their flaws, and they'll give you a carefully curated list that maintains their self-image. Ask them what kind of person they can't stand, and they'll unknowingly map their psychological blind spots for you.
If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.
Now that you understand the shadow mechanism, you're ready for Jung's first psychological X-ray. This question will slice through someone's persona like a scalpel, revealing not just their hidden nature, but the very qualities they've spent a lifetime trying to escape. Jung's first question is deceptively simple. What type of person do you absolutely cannot tolerate? Watch what happens when you ask this. People's eyes light up. They lean forward. Suddenly they're animated, passionate, specific. Why? Because you've given them permission to talk about their shadow without realizing it. They think they're telling you about other people, but they're actually giving you a psychological blueprint of their own rejected self. Let me show you how this works in practice. David, a 41-year-old financial advisor, responds immediately. I can't stand people who are always complaining. You know the type. Everything's wrong. Nothing's ever their fault. The world owes them something. They're just weak. Notice the emotional charge in David's response, the slight sneer when he says weak, the way his voice hardens. Jung would tell you that David's shadow contains exactly what he's rejecting: his own capacity for vulnerability, for admitting when life is difficult, for asking for support. David has built his identity around being self-reliant and positive, but the psychological cost is that he's disowned his own human fragility. Here's the pattern Jung discovered. The intensity of someone's judgment reveals the depth of their repression. The more emotionally charged their response, the closer you're getting to their core shadow material. But let's dig deeper into why this question is so psychologically revealing. When Maria, a perfectionist project manager, says she can't stand sloppy, careless people, she's not just expressing a preference, she's revealing her terror of being seen as incompetent. Her shadow contains the relaxed, good enough person she's never allowed herself to be. Every time she encounters someone who seems comfortable with imperfection, it triggers her buried fear that maybe she's been exhausting herself for no reason. The psychological mechanism becomes even more fascinating when you realize that we often hate most intensely the qualities we secretly envy. Take Jennifer, a reserved accountant who says she despises attention seekers and show-offs. Jung would point out that Jennifer's shadow likely contains a suppressed performer, someone who wants to be seen and celebrated, but has convinced herself that visibility is shameful or dangerous. This is where Jung's insight becomes practically powerful for reading people. Listen for these telltale signs when someone answers. Pay attention to these signs when someone answers you. First, watch for the immediate emotional reaction. If they respond fast and with strong feelings, you've touched on shadow material. People don't get worked up over traits that don't hit close to home. Next, listen for moral language. Words like disgusting, pathetic, or unforgivable. When someone judges that harshly, it usually points to qualities they've rejected in themselves. The stronger the judgment, the deeper the repression. Third, notice if they give specific behavioural details. When they describe exactly how those people act, it often means they've been paying close attention, because they're wrestling with the same traits inside. And finally, watch out for sweeping generalizations. If they say things like, "I can't stand all politicians," or "I hate corporate types," Jung would say, that's projection. They're dumping shadow material onto an entire group so they don't have to see it in themselves. Let's watch this play out with Alex, a startup founder who says he can't tolerate people who play it safe, who never take risks, who settle for mediocrity. On the surface, this seems to align with his entrepreneurial identity, but Jung would ask, what if Alex's shadow contains the part of himself that craves security, that's terrified of failure, that sometimes just wants a stable paycheck and predictable life? His contempt for safe people might be his way of drowning out an internal voice that whispers, maybe this is too risky. Maybe you should just get a normal job. The beauty of this question is that it works in reverse too. When someone struggles to answer, when they say things like, "I try not to judge people," or "everyone has their reasons," Jung would be equally intrigued. This might indicate someone who's so afraid of their own judgment that they've suppressed their natural discriminating instincts, which is itself a form of shadow material. Here's where the question becomes a tool for deeper understanding rather than manipulation. When you see someone's shadow through their judgments, you're seeing their humanity. Rebecca's harsh judgment of incompetent people reveals her own fear of not measuring up. David's contempt for complainers shows you his terror of appearing weak. This isn't ammunition for attack, it's a roadmap for empathy. But perhaps most powerfully, this question forces you to confront your own shadow. Try answering it yourself right now. What type of person can you absolutely not tolerate? Whatever you just thought, that impatient person, that fake-friendly networker, that lazy co-worker, Jung would invite you to ask, where does this quality live in me? The psychological growth happens when you stop seeing your judgments as accurate assessments of others and start seeing them as information about your own disowned parts. That's when you begin what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole by reclaiming the pieces of yourself you've scattered into your shadow. Jung's second question strikes at something even more fundamental than our projections, our relationship with our own fallibility. This question reveals whether someone possesses what Jung considered the hallmark of psychological maturity, the ability to hold their ego lightly enough to learn and grow. Jung's second question cuts straight to the core. Tell me about a time you were absolutely certain you were right, but turned out to be completely wrong. The moment you ask this, you'll witness something fascinating. Watch their face. Notice the pause. Some people's eyes will dart away. Others will immediately start calculating what story makes them look best. A few will laugh nervously and claim they can't think of anything. But the rare person who can answer authentically, who can sit with the discomfort and vulnerability this question creates, has revealed something profound about their psychological architecture. Here's why this question is so psychologically penetrating. Being wrong threatens what Jung called the ego ideal, our internal image of ourselves as competent, intelligent, and in control. When that image cracks, most people's psychological defense systems activate immediately. They'll rationalize, minimize, or deflect to protect their sense of self. Let me show you how this plays out. Marcus, a confident sales director, is asked this question during a team dinner. He pauses for a long moment, then says, "Well, I thought our biggest client was going to renew their contract. I was so sure that I told my team to start planning the expansion, but they ended up going with a competitor." Notice what's missing from Marcus's story? Any acknowledgement of his role in the misjudgment, any curiosity about why he was so certain, any genuine reflection on what he learned. Jung would call this a deflection response, technically answering the question while avoiding its psychological impact. Now contrast that with Lisa, a marketing manager who immediately brightens when asked, "Oh, that's easy. Last year I was convinced our new campaign was brilliant. I fought tooth and nail for it, completely dismissed my team's concerns about the messaging being too complex. When it launched, it flopped spectacularly. I was so embarrassed. But then I realized I'd been so attached to being seen as the creative genius that I'd stopped listening to anyone else. It was actually a huge wake-up call. Notice the difference? Lisa's response contains what Jung considered psychological gold: genuine self-reflection, emotional honesty, and evidence of growth. She didn't just admit being wrong. She explored why she was wrong and what it taught her about herself. Jung discovered that how people answer this question reveals their relationship with their own imperfection. Here are the psychological patterns to watch for. First, the deflectors. They'll give you an answer, but shift the blame somewhere else. You'll hear things like, "I was right based on the information I had," or "other people didn't execute properly." These kinds of responses protect the ego, but they also block real learning. Next, the minimizers. They'll say things like, "It wasn't that big a deal," or "I was mostly right except for one small thing." Sure, they admit an error, but at the same time, they downplay its importance so it doesn't sting. Then you've got the non-responders. They'll insist, "I'm usually pretty accurate," or "I can't think of any major mistakes." Jung would say their ego defenses are so rigid, they've actually blocked out memories that might threaten their self-image. And finally, the integrators. These are the rare ones. They tell the story with curiosity, not defensiveness. They reflect on their thinking process, admit the emotional impact, and pull out real lessons. These are the signs of genuine psychological maturity. But here's where Jung's insight becomes deeply practical for your relationships. The person who can't admit being wrong isn't just protecting their ego in that moment. They're revealing a fundamental rigidity that will show up everywhere. They'll struggle to apologize meaningfully, resist feedback, and blame others when things go sideways. Jung would say their psychological development has been stunted by their inability to integrate failure into their self-concept. Consider Rachel, a brilliant consultant who, when asked this question, immediately tenses up. "I don't really make major mistakes. I mean, sometimes market conditions change, but my analysis is usually solid." This response tells you volumes. Rachel has built her identity around being right, which means being wrong feels like an existential threat. Jung would predict that working with Rachel involves walking on eggshells, that she'll double down on poor decisions rather than course correct, and that any criticism will be met with defensiveness. The psychological sophistication of this question lies in what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Psychologically healthy people can simultaneously believe in their own competence while acknowledging their fallibility. They can feel proud of their successes while learning from their failures. This isn't contradiction, it's integration. Watch what happens when you ask this question in different contexts. In romantic relationships, someone who can't genuinely acknowledge being wrong is revealing their inability to repair and grow. In business settings, they're showing you whether they can adapt when strategies fail. In friendships, they're demonstrating whether they can maintain connection through conflict. But perhaps most importantly, this question forces you to examine your own psychological maturity. Try answering it honestly. When were you absolutely certain you were right but completely wrong? Can you tell that story with curiosity rather than shame? Can you explore what led to your certainty without immediately defending your thought process? Jung believed that our relationship with being wrong is actually our relationship with growth itself. The person who can be genuinely wrong, feel the full impact of that wrongness, and then integrate the experience into their understanding of themselves and the world, that person is psychologically alive. They're still growing, still learning, still becoming. The others, Jung would say they've chosen the psychological safety of stagnation over the vulnerable adventure of authentic development. Now you possess Jung's 2 psychological keys, but knowing the questions is only half the power. The real mastery comes in reading the responses, seeing past the words to the psychological landscape they reveal. Jung discovered that certain patterns in how people answer these questions serve as reliable indicators of character, maturity, and potential relationship dynamics. Let's decode what you're really seeing when someone responds to these questions. Pattern 1. The immediate deflector. When you ask about people they can't stand, they immediately flip the script. I try not to judge people. Everyone has their struggles. Or when asked about being wrong, what about you? I'm sure you've made mistakes too. Jung would call this psychological deflection. They're so uncomfortable with self-examination that they'll do anything to shift focus away from themselves. This isn't necessarily malicious, but it reveals someone who's built identity walls so thick that even gentle exploration feels threatening. In relationships, expect surface-level connections and difficulty with vulnerability. Pattern 2, the group projectionist. I can't stand all politicians, or corporate executives are all corrupt, or social media influencers are just narcissists. When someone projects their shadow onto entire groups rather than acknowledging individual traits, Jung identified this as psychological splitting, dividing the world into us versus them to avoid inner complexity. These responses reveal rigid thinking patterns that will show up everywhere. They'll struggle with nuance in relationships, tend toward black and white judgments, and have difficulty acknowledging positive qualities in people they've categorized as bad. Pattern 3, the emotional volcano. Watch for disproportionate emotional reactions. When someone's voice hardens, their posture changes, or they launch into detailed rants about specific behaviors, you've struck psychological gold. The intensity reveals how much shadow material you've uncovered. Take Michael, a normally calm manager, who becomes visibly agitated discussing people who don't follow through on commitments. His reaction intensity suggests this trait represents something he's terrified of in himself, perhaps his own tendency toward overcommitment or his fear of disappointing others. Pattern 4, the perfect historian. These are the people who can recall being wrong, but frame it as a fascinating case study rather than a personal failure. It's interesting how market dynamics shifted, they'll say, or the data was misleading at the time. They sound reflective, but Jung would point out they're intellectualizing to avoid the emotional impact. This reveals someone who processes experiences through analysis rather than integration. They're often brilliant problem solvers, but may struggle with emotional intimacy or genuine vulnerability. Pattern 5, the psychological gold standard. Rarely you'll encounter someone who can answer both questions with what Jung called authentic self-reflection. They'll identify specific traits that trigger them and show genuine curiosity about why. They'll share stories of being wrong with a mixture of humor and genuine learning. These responses indicate psychological integration, someone who's doing the difficult work of owning their complete self, shadows and all. Jung would say these are the people capable of deep relationships, continuous growth, and genuine intimacy. But here's where Jung's approach becomes strategically powerful. Use these patterns to predict relationship dynamics. If someone deflects self-examination in casual conversation, they'll deflect accountability in conflict. If they project their shadow onto entire groups, they'll struggle with seeing your perspective when you disagree. If they can't genuinely acknowledge being wrong, they'll double down on relationship mistakes rather than repair them. Sarah discovered this with her ex-partner, James. When she first asked him about people he couldn't stand, he immediately said, "I don't really judge people like that." She found this admirable at the time. But over 2 years of dating, she realized James never took responsibility for relationship problems either. His inability to acknowledge his own judgments paralleled his inability to acknowledge his own mistakes. Jung would call this consistent psychological architecture. The same defense mechanisms show up everywhere. The shadow gold mine technique. Here's Jung's most sophisticated insight. The traits someone judges most harshly often point to their unrealized potential. The person who despises show-offs might be suppressing their own charisma. The individual who can't tolerate emotional people may have buried their own capacity for deep feeling. Listen for what Jung called shadow gold, the positive qualities hiding in someone's rejections. When David expressed contempt for people who waste time on relationships instead of focusing on success, Jung would ask, what if David's shadow contains his suppressed need for connection? What if his driven professional persona has cost him the very intimacy he secretly craves? Practical application in real relationships. Use these insights compassionately. When you see someone's shadow through their judgments, you're seeing their humanity. That colleague who can't stand incompetent people is revealing their own fear of not measuring up. That friend who despises attention seekers might be showing you their own unmet need for recognition. This knowledge isn't ammunition for attack, it's a roadmap for deeper understanding. When you recognize that someone's harsh judgments often reflect their own struggles, you can respond with empathy rather than defensiveness. But perhaps most importantly, use these questions on yourself regularly. Jung believed that psychological development requires continuous shadow work, the ongoing process of recognizing and integrating the parts of yourself you've disowned. Ask yourself, who can't you tolerate lately? What does that reveal about your current psychological state? When did you last genuinely acknowledge being wrong without defending your original reasoning? The answers will show you where your own growth edge lies. Throughout this exploration, you've been learning to read others through Jung's psychological lens. But here's the twist Jung always emphasized. These questions aren't just tools for understanding other people. They're mirrors that reflect your own hidden psychological landscape. And if you're brave enough to look, they'll show you truths about yourself that might surprise you. Let's turn Jung's spotlight inward. Right now, before reading further, try answering both questions honestly. What type of person can you absolutely not tolerate? Tell me about a time you were certain you were right, but completely wrong. Notice what just happened in your mind. Did you answer immediately, or did you hesitate? Did you feel defensive? Did you start editing your responses to sound more reasonable or self-aware? Jung would say that your internal process of answering reveals as much as your actual answers. If you found yourself thinking, "I don't really judge people," Jung would be fascinated. This might indicate that you've suppressed your natural discriminating instincts, perhaps because you learned early that having preferences or judgments wasn't acceptable. Your shadow might contain a sharper, more discerning person who's been buried under layers of people-pleasing. If you immediately thought of several types you can't stand, Jung would want to explore the emotional charge behind each judgment. That impatience with indecisive people might reveal your own terror of making wrong choices. Your irritation with fake positive people could point to your own struggle with authentic emotional expression. Let me share how this played out for Emma, a successful therapist who prided herself on being non-judgmental. When forced to answer Jung's first question, she reluctantly admitted, "I suppose I get frustrated with people who are always playing victim, who blame everyone else for their problems." As soon as she said it, she felt guilty. Wasn't she supposed to have compassion for everyone? But Jung would tell Emma that her judgment reveals something crucial about her psychological development. Perhaps Emma's shadow contains her own disowned vulnerability, the parts of herself that have felt helpless or hurt, but that she's never allowed expression because her identity is built on being strong and helpful to others. This is the psychological sophistication of Jung's approach. Your judgments are information about your inner world, not objective truths about other people. When you feel visceral disgust at certain behaviors, you're usually encountering aspects of yourself that you've rejected or disowned. Consider Tom, a detail-oriented engineer who can't stand sloppy, careless people. Jung would ask Tom to explore what he's rejected in himself. Maybe Tom's shadow contains his own capacity for spontaneity, for good enough rather than perfect, for relaxation and flow. His judgment of careless people might be his psyche's way of maintaining a rigid identity that's actually exhausting him. But here's where Jung's insight becomes personally transformative. The traits you judge most harshly often point to qualities you need to reclaim. If you can't tolerate attention seekers, maybe your shadow holds your suppressed need to be seen and appreciated. If lazy people drive you crazy, perhaps you've disowned your own need for rest and restoration. The psychological growth happens when you stop seeing your judgments as evidence of other people's flaws and start seeing them as clues to your own disowned parts. That's the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole by integrating all aspects of yourself, even the ones you've decided are unacceptable. Now let's examine your relationship with being wrong. Jung discovered that how you handle your own fallibility reveals your psychological flexibility and capacity for growth. If you couldn't think of a time you were significantly wrong, Jung would be concerned about what he called psychological inflation, an ego so rigid that it can't tolerate imperfection. But if you immediately thought of several examples, notice which story you chose to share, even if just to yourself. Did you pick something relatively minor, something where external circumstances played a major role? Or did you choose a moment of genuine misjudgment where you had to face uncomfortable truths about your own thinking process? Maria, a marketing director, initially wanted to share a story about a campaign that failed due to budget cuts and changing market conditions. But when she pushed herself to be more honest, she admitted, "Actually, there was the time I was convinced our new hire was lazy and unfocused. I was pretty harsh in my feedback, and I even started building a case for letting him go. Turns out he was dealing with a serious family illness he hadn't shared. When I finally found out, I realized my good judgment was just impatience and assumptions." Notice how Maria's second story requires much more vulnerability. She had to acknowledge not just being factually wrong, but being wrong in a way that revealed her own character flaws, impatience, assumption-making, lack of curiosity about others' circumstances. Jung would say, this kind of honest self-examination is the foundation of psychological growth, the integration challenge. Here's Jung's ultimate insight about these questions. They're not just diagnostic tools, they're invitations to psychological integration. When you recognize that your harshest judgments often reflect your own disowned qualities, You face a choice. You can continue projecting these traits onto others, or you can begin the difficult work of reclaiming them as part of your complete self. This doesn't mean accepting destructive behaviors in yourself or others. It means developing what Jung called compassionate discrimination, the ability to see clearly without losing your humanity. When you recognize that the attention-seeking behavior you despise in others reflects your own unmet need for recognition, you don't start seeking attention destructively. Instead, you find healthy ways to meet that need while developing empathy for others who might be struggling with the same issue. The ongoing practice. Jung believed that shadow work, the process of recognizing and integrating disowned parts of yourself, is a lifelong practice. These two questions become tools for continuous self-discovery. Notice who's been irritating you lately. What does that reveal about your current psychological state? When did you last have to genuinely acknowledge being wrong about something important? Your answers will shift over time as you grow and integrate different aspects of yourself. The goal isn't to eliminate all judgments. Jung believed healthy discrimination is essential. The goal is to hold your judgments lightly as information about your internal world rather than absolute truths about external reality. This is the deeper purpose of Jung's psychological approach, not just to read others more accurately, but to know yourself more completely. And when you know yourself more completely, shadows and all, you become capable of the kind of authentic relationships and genuine growth that make life meaningful. You now possess something potentially dangerous, the ability to see past the masks everyone wears, including your own. Jung's two questions have given you psychological X-ray vision, but with this power comes a responsibility that Jung himself wrestled with throughout his career. How do you use this knowledge without becoming manipulative? How do you see people's shadows without losing compassion for their humanity? Let's address the elephant in the room. Knowing someone's psychological blind spots gives you power over them. When you understand that Robert's contempt for needy people reflects his own terror of dependency, you could exploit that knowledge. When you recognize that Linda's inability to admit mistakes stems from deep-seated shame, you could weaponize her vulnerability. Jung was acutely aware of this danger. He called it psychological inflation, the tendency to feel superior to others once you understand their unconscious patterns. But Jung warned that this superiority is itself a shadow trap. The moment you start using psychological insights to manipulate or feel better than others, you've fallen into your own unconscious pattern. Here's the ethical framework Jung developed for using this knowledge responsibly. Use insight for understanding, not advantage. When you see someone's shadow through their judgments, you're seeing their humanity, their struggles, their unlived potential. This should increase your compassion, not your sense of superiority. Sarah's harsh judgment of incompetent people isn't evidence that she's a bad person. It's a window into her own fear of not measuring up. Apply the mirror principle consistently. Every judgment you make about someone else's psychology applies to you as well. If you notice that Mark deflects responsibility when asked about being wrong, ask yourself, when do I deflect responsibility? Jung believed that we can only see in others what exists in ourselves, so your insights about others are always also insights about your own psychological patterns. Respect the timing of people's development. Just because you can see someone's shadow doesn't mean they're ready to see it. Pushing people to confront their unconscious patterns before they're psychologically prepared can be harmful. Jung spent decades learning to time his interpretations carefully. Sometimes the kindest thing is to simply understand someone without trying to change them. But here's where Jung's approach becomes truly transformative, rather than just analytical. The real power isn't in reading others, it's in the self-knowledge these questions force you to develop. Every time you use these questions, you're also examining your own psychological landscape. When you ask someone what type of person they can't stand, you're simultaneously confronting your own judgments and projections. When you explore how someone handles being wrong, you're also examining your own relationship with fallibility and growth. This creates what Jung called a mutual analysis. Both people in the interaction are potentially transformed by the exchange. The questions don't just reveal character, they develop it. Consider this real-world application. Lisa, a project manager, noticed that her team member, Jake, consistently deflected responsibility when projects went wrong. Using Jung's insights, she recognized this pattern, but instead of confronting Jake directly, she examined her own relationship with failure. She realized she'd created a team culture where admitting mistakes felt dangerous because she herself had been defensive about project failures in front of senior management. By addressing her own psychological pattern first, Lisa changed the team dynamic in a way that allowed Jake to be more honest about his mistakes. The insight about Jake's character became a mirror that helped Lisa see and change her own leadership style. The transformation principle. Here's Jung's most profound insight about psychological development. You cannot change what you cannot see, but once you see clearly, change becomes inevitable. When someone genuinely recognizes their own shadow patterns, when they see how their judgments reflect their own disowned qualities, they face a choice that's fundamentally transformative. They can continue projecting these qualities onto others, or they can begin the difficult but liberating work of integration. Most people, once they truly see their own psychological patterns, choose growth over stagnation. This is why Jung's questions are ultimately tools of liberation rather than manipulation. When you help someone see their own shadow through modeling self-awareness rather than pointing out their blind spots, you're offering them freedom from unconscious patterns that have been running their life. The ripple effect. Perhaps, most importantly, developing this level of psychological insight changes how you move through the world. When you understand that everyone is struggling with their own shadow material, when you recognize that harsh judgments usually reflect personal pain, when you see that defensive behaviors often protect vulnerable core beliefs, you naturally become more compassionate. You stop taking others' behavior so personally because you understand it's usually about their internal world, not about you. You become more curious and less reactive. You develop what Jung called differentiated empathy, the ability to understand without absorbing, to see clearly without losing compassion. Your ongoing practice. Jung believed that psychological development is a lifelong journey, not a destination. These two questions become tools for continuous self-discovery and growth. Use them regularly, on yourself first, then as a way to understand others more deeply. Notice when you're judging someone harshly. Ask yourself, what does this reveal about my shadow? When you make a mistake, practice genuine acknowledgement rather than defensiveness. Watch how your relationships transform when you approach them with curiosity rather than judgment. The ultimate goal isn't to become a master manipulator who can read everyone's psychology. It's to become a more conscious, compassionate, authentic human being who can connect with others at a deeper level because you've done the work of understanding yourself. That's the true power of Jung's approach, not the ability to control others, but the capacity to free yourself from the unconscious patterns that have been controlling you. And when you're free, you naturally create space for others to become more free as well. The questions are simple. The implications are profound. The choice of how to use them is yours. Are you ready to see what's really beneath the surface, in others and in yourself? The mirror is waiting.